there are numbers in the report that that some are interpreting that way, but I don't think it's the right interpretation. Actually, to maybe understand what's happening, those greenhouse gases, in particular CO2, which is the main greenhouse gas coming from human activities, coming from the burning of fossil fuel, is a gas that traps heat in the climate system. So it lets the energy from the sun coming in, but it traps the heat that is emitted by the surface of the planet in the form of an invisible radiation called infrared radiation. So it plays a little bit the same role as, clothing that you put on yourself when you are cold, because it traps, well, clothing traps the body heat, but the greenhouse gases trap the heat that is present at the surface of our planet. And that comparison helps to understand why, if that insulation layer, that clothing layer, increases in thickness, well, underneath you get warmer. Now, this thickness will increase as long as we emit more than what natural systems can absorb, because CO2 is in part absorbed by the forest, for example. So that's one of the reasons why it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why it's important to keep forests in the best possible shape. And another part of those CO2 emissions from human activities is absorbed by the ocean. But together, the ocean and the forests are only able to absorb half of our emissions. And it's the other half which accumulates in the atmosphere. And that means that as long as we emit more than what the ocean and forests can absorb, the thickness of that insulation layer is going to increase. Now, in a sense, with the insulation layer we have now, which is already 50% thicker than at the beginning of the industrial period, at the end of the 19th century, we are seeing all those impacts. We are seeing that warming of 1.1 degrees C and all those extreme events, and this sea level rise, etc. So, in a sense, it is not by 2050 that ideally we should reach carbon neutrality. It's tomorrow morning. So we don't have 12 years. We don't even have 12 hours. It's now that ideally we need to start to turn the pathway of the emissions, so that instead of increasing and continue to increase as they do right now, even after COVID, the concentration still has increased significantly in 2020 compared to the preceding years. So we really need to turn that curve back to much lower emissions and ultimately to net zero. And the sooner we do that, the better. So it's not a question of 12 years. It's not a question of 50 years. It's a question of starting now as quickly as we can, and with as much will as we can have.
Okay, thank you so much, because that question of the years of 2030, which is 12 years as a then, 2050 is really delaying action. And thank you that you have clarified it, that the time to act is now. And we have to act quick, because the climate crisis is not waiting. It doesn't take a break. It keeps increasing and keep making humanity to be prone to it. And I want to also say next that what will it take for the world to act against the climate crisis?
It's a good question. I mean, I would like to know the answer. I'm really hoping that it's a bit sad to say that, but that the impacts that are becoming more visible every day, and which are starting to have severe consequences for humans and for ecosystems and for the environment in general, as they become more and more visible, should ideally make people and leaders in particular realize the urgency of doing much more to protect not only climate but environment in general. You know, we're talking about climate. I mean, it's a parenthesis, but I think it's an important parenthesis. We're talking about climate now, but what happens in the area of biodiversity is at least as important. I mean, we need to have ecosystems in a good health for human well-being, and by neglecting both the climate and the biodiversity crisis, we're actually sowing the branch on which humanity is seated. It's actually the other face of the same coin, because if we want to have as little suffering as possible, we need to prevent as much as possible future climate change becoming more intense. And that's the area we mentioned about the need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. But the other face of the coin, which is equally important, is, as you said, to increase the preparedness, to increase the resilience, to adapt to the part of climate change that is there already. And both are not opposed. I mean, we need both. We need adaptation, we need resilience, and we also need mitigation, because if we don't mitigate, if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions in particular, at some point, adaptation will become almost impossible or extremely costly. So it's really a combination of both mitigation and adaptation which is needed. For example, for sea level, well, you know, mitigation will help to decrease the rate of sea level rise in the future. And of course, it's easier to adapt to a sea level rise movement when it's slower than when it's faster. But you also need to try to adapt. So it may mean, but it depends on each location, and I don't know the particular case of Lagos, but it might mean reinforcing dikes in some cases. It might mean deciding that some part of the city which is closer to the sea is no more developed, and that no more buildings are built there. I mean, there's a range of measures that can be taken in the area of adaptation. But what's clear is that both adaptation, preparedness, resilience, and mitigation, that is reducing the amount of greenhouse gases emitted, both are needed.
Thank you so much. So this leads me to the next question that talked about policy making, because the aim of this report too is to help policymakers to make accurate and balanced policy. So does it mean that policy differs from one country to another? And what policy can spring forth from this report that can help our governments?
Well, Adenike, I'm going to disappoint you, because this report is not going to directly help to answer that questions, because the IPCC is divided in 3 working groups mainly. And this is only the report of the first working group dealing with climate science. You know, the climate science aspects of the issue. There will be a second part of this report that will be published in February next year, and that part will deal exactly with what we were discussing a minute ago: adaptation, resilience, vulnerability, and how to reduce the severity of impacts. That will be for February 2022. And then a month later, in March, it will be the third working group that will deal with the question you just raised, that mitigation and how to reduce to reduce the emissions, and what are the choices that policymakers have. So the answer to your very good question is not in this particular report released on August 9.
Okay, thank you for that clarity, because everybody will be thinking, oh, we are the policies, you know. So this kind of interview is going to build the mind of people to understand what this report is all about, you know. So thank you so much.
In a summary, it's a report which will highlight one of the major aspects of the urgency to act, but it's not going to explain how to act. Now, you know, very frankly, if you read again the previous report from IPCC, the IPCC has existed for 31 years now. It's more than 31 years. Its first report was published 31 years in 1990. If you read, for example, the latest report on adaptation and mitigation that were published in 2014, you will find plenty of possible policies that policymakers could implement if they want.
I agree. I agree. I've come across such reports. You know, that's why I brought this policy out of it. Maybe this report too came with policy. But thank you so much that you clarified it. So the next question is, does this report propel in fresh commitments for leaders? Because we have been seeing different commitments, promises, you know. Does it need another commitment, or for us to just stick to those commitments? And the current commitment we have, can it meet up with this report? Like, is he up to the standard of this report? Thank you.
Well, to answer that question, you won't find the answer to that question in this particular report, because, as I said, it doesn't deal with the policy aspects of it. It's a report on basically on climate science, the natural science aspects of the question. But if you stand back and if you read other sources of information, for example, the synthesis of the present commitments made by the Secretariat of the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement, it's very clear that the commitments that have been made up to now, and which still in many cases need to be implemented, because a commitment is nice, but unless it's implemented, it doesn't mean anything for clients. But the sum of those commitments is clearly not at the level that's needed. But that's not something that the IPCC says in its latest report, because the IPCC latest report doesn't deal with that. But there are so many other sources of information which confirm that indeed the commitments that we have now at the world level are very insufficient.
Thank you so much. Thank you.